Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogmen, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful.
Well, and how is everybody doing? This is Marlene with Stories of the Supernatural. And this week, instead of having a regular guest, I've had some requests for doing some in-home stories. And I decided to go into, I want to say, one of the most well-known type of phantoms that you hear about, even though there's different versions, which is white ladies, right? There's the white lady that haunts here, the white lady that haunts there, the white lady hitchhiker. I mean, there was a lot to pick from, believe me. And I said, you know what? I'm going to find something new, and I'm going to find something that has been around for a while, as a long while, you'll see, and let you guys enjoy it, because really when it comes down to it, white ladies abound. And some of them do deserve, by the way, that moniker of the white lady, especially since it turns out that not all the time, but a lot of times, seeing one of these white ladies basically came with a curse. All right, a curse, either she was foretelling the doom of your family, you, or in some cases, like a natural disaster, something was going to happen. In other words, it was not just that you were frightened because you saw the white lady. It was that if anybody saw her, disaster was on the horizon. So I'm going to go off to the first one. We're gonna go to modern times, and this has to do with a white lady that's seen in a part of Texas known as White Rock Lake. Now, she is one of the most famous apparitions, and she's a hitchhiking white lady seen on the shore of White Rock Lake in Dallas, Texas. Now, who was she? And is she the only one who haunts this place? And you're going to see why that's an important question. Now, as to this area that eventually became White Rock Lake, bison herds once roamed across what was White Rock Valley, which was part of the Blackland Prairie. White Rock Lake, located in northeast Dallas, Texas, was formed after the White Rock Creek was dammed. The reservoir flooded over farms owned by the Cox and Daniel families and who settled there in the 1830s and 1840s. The only thing left of the Cox and Daniel farms is the Cox Cemetery. The Daniel family fell on hard times, and the renovation funds contributed by the Cox family earned it a new name. Other pioneer families buried there are the Glovers, the Humbards, Lavenders, McComases, Donaghys. Approximately 500 people are interred there. I imagine probably much more than that, but as far as the ones that are recognized. The dam was completed in 1911, and through the years, a bathhouse with a dancing pavilion next to it and boathouses were reconstructed. Now, in 1935, the Civilian Conservation Corps built structures at Winfrey Point and planted hundreds of trees. During World War II, it was turned into a boot camp for 2 years. In 1944, it was a prisoner of war camp which held over 400 German non-combatants who had served under Rommel and were captured in the North Africa campaign. Now, during its time that it was being used by the general public, people came there to fish, to swim, boat in the reservoir, which spans a little over 1,000 acres. And in 1952, swimming was banned, I believe, because they started to use the reservoir as a water source for the city. Now, the Lady of White Rock Lake is an urban myth connected to the area, and like many tales of this type, she's described in different ways. In one instance, she's a 20-something girl wearing a 1930s era evening dress. The consensus is that she met her end in a night boating accident or a car accident. Cited as a lonely girl trudging along the roadside of East Lother Drive, she asked to be taken to a house on Gaston Avenue. Sometime during the trip, she disappears, leaving only a wetness where she sat. She has also appeared on lake-fronting porches, where she asked to use a telephone before disappearing. Another version describes her as a beautiful girl with short black hair wearing a wedding dress. She tells the driver who stopped for her that her name is Jill Walters and gives him the address of 720 Island Way, just 5 minutes from where he picked her up at. Other times it's an address on Gaston Avenue, a street that leads to the lake. She disappears, and the Good Samaritan who gave her a ride arrives at the address only to find out she drowned 2 years before at the lake, the day before she was to get married. Like many of these ghost stories, an alternate storyline is that she died when her ex-boyfriend drove off into the lake when she told him she was marrying another man. In 1943, Anne Clark, on behalf of the Texas Folklore Society's publication Backwoods to Border, wrote the story The Ghost of White Rock. In this retelling, a young couple is parked on the shore of the lake. When they switch on the headlights, they see a young woman dressed in a sheer, white, wet dress walking towards them. She tells them her boat overturned and she must get home. The others on the boat are safe. The address she gives is in the town of Oak Cliff. However, before long she disappears, leaving only a wet seat. They go to the address she gave them, and a man tells them her daughter drowned 3 weeks before while sailing on White Rock Lake. In yet another version, the person living at the home tells the puzzled motorist they've described a woman who lived in the house many years before, but she drowned in the lake. In 1953, Frank X. Tolbert tells of a night when Guy Malloy, who was director of display for Neiman Marcus, is accompanied by his wife Josephine. They see a blonde girl standing on the beach. She asks them to be taken to Gaston Avenue. Suddenly, she disappears. And when they come to the address, a man tells them his daughter died 2 years before when she fell off a pier at White Rock Lake. The story was later embellished where she was wearing a Neiman Marcus dress, but the original story had the girl dressed in a raincoat. Malloy had one of the first homes at White Rock Lake. Now, we need to ask ourselves, was the Lady of White Rock based in fact? It's not certain how far back the sightings of the White Lady go, but many believe it started in the 1930s. Here are some women that found sudden death or were quite unhappy when they were alive. In 1927, Hallie Enid Gaston, 19, drowned in the lake after her boat capsized. It's worth noting her surname of Gaston. If she is the hitchhiking lady, was she telling the driver her name and not the street? In 1935, Louise Ford Davis drowned herself at the lake. She was married to Earl H. Davis, but the one who found her suicide note was her sister Esther Doyle, who called police within minutes of discovering the note. They sent 7 squad cars, but found her bobbing in the water, and they could not resuscitate her. In November 1942, a fisherman found the coat and hat with a note pinned to them on the shore of the lake. The items belonged to Nora Rose Stone, 37, and she asked that a sister in Fort Worth be notified. Police dragged waters near the public boathouses in search of her body. Her relatives came to help police, and according to the newspapers, They said she had been in poor health recently and her husband was in the army. A day later, her corpse is recovered. Now, the story has changed. There is no mention made of a husband in the army or otherwise, and Stone was her maiden name. Her sister said she had recently returned from Washington because she had been in ill health. Later reports were that she was a stenographer working for the government who had a nervous breakdown. Her death certificate listed her as divorced. She had married Cleve Bowers McCormick in 1930. If there was an exact reason why she took her life, it was never revealed. Perhaps it had something to do with her ex-husband, Cleve, and he has a story all unto himself that I decided to include here. Cleve Bowers McCormick was born in 1892 in the small town of Zwolle, Louisiana. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's either Zwolle or Zwolle. He married Pearl Richardson in 1912. By 1917, the marriage seemed to be over since he made the papers after he was sued for marriage annulment because he promised his fiancée a $2,000 diamond ring, among other things. Garnett McCormick, that was her name, a picture theater cashier in Oklahoma, said her husband, a soldier at Fort Sill, had threatened her that if she failed to marry him, he would prosecute her and her family legally since he had procured a marriage license. She described him as eccentric and with a violent disposition. He told her, quote, that unless she would consent to marry him, he would kill her and himself, end quote. He also represented himself as a man of wealth and promised a diamond engagement ring. Later, she found out he earned $33 a month as a soldier's salary and that he owned no property. She had not lived with him for the 3 months it took to procure the annulment. Cleve married the unhappy Nora Stone around 1930, and the 1940 census they were still living together. Sometimes after this, they divorced. In 1946, Elizabeth McCormick, wife number 4, divorced Cleve. Nothing is known about the circumstances. However, she was the one that petitioned it. His last marriage was to Martha Shaw in 1954. After this, he was found that year dead inside his parked car near the Veterans Hospital. He was a watchman for a construction company, and it was determined he died from a heart attack. At first, it was suspected to be a suicide. He seemed an odd fellow, to say the least, and perhaps part of the ghost story that involves a vengeful boyfriend that refuses to end the relationship is based on him. Cleve McCormick had his own sad family history. His father, Johnny McCormick, a Sabine Parish marshal, was killed in a street duel in 1898 when he was 26 years old. This swath of Zwolle, Louisiana, was known as No Man's Land, a haven for outlaws. He was attempting to arrest Nicanor Sepulveda, who was raising a disturbance. He resisted, pulled a pistol, and at close range shot McCormick in the stomach. The constable then pulled his pistol and fired 3 bullets into Sepulveda, killing him on the spot. But let's not lay all the hauntings at the feet of the lady. There might be more than one ghost there. In 1926, the year before Hallie Gaston drowned, Joseph Jaworski, the son of the prominent Waco family, was discovered floating under a pier at White Rock Lake. The 25-year-old engineer had been missing for 3 days. It was alluded that it was an accident, but since his father was a minister, a suicide could possibly have been covered up. In May 1929, 3 high school boys drowned in the lake after their boat overturned. They had been fishing. In 1941, the body of Louis David, a former convict, was found killed gangland style. Riddled with 5 shots, he was found near White Rock Lake. In 1948, Mrs. Maurice Marriott, 40, fell from a motorboat and drowned. She had clutched a life preserver thrown out to her, but then went under. In 1953, Russell Gardner, 21, drowned after jumping from his motorboat before it exploded. In 1964, Samuel C. Turney, 51, was recovered from White Rock Lake. Like Nora Stone, he left clothes, a wallet, and a note on the shore. That same year, a construction company foreman was killed when he fell beneath a tread tractor at a road project near White Rock Lake. He was 29 years old. The mystery of who is the lady might never be solved, and if not, she perhaps keeps good company from those that met their end at White Rock Lake, just like her. So there you go. That is the story of the White Lady at White Rock Lake, which, if you look at it, yes, and there might be a white lady, but there might be a lot of other ghosts running around there that could account for some of the strange happenings. And all of these deaths, of course, were around the time period, even though they say this sighting of the White Lady goes back all the way to the 1930s. But even people apparently that have their houses surrounding the lake have had their own encounters of some type. But now let's go back to a much, much older version of a white lady. And this one you'll see is it's a little bit worse than having a girl wanting to get a ride from you. Now, this white lady, like the other one, you're going to see there's always more than one suspect. You know how they always say the usual suspects? Well, there's more than one suspect, just like the other one. And this one, of course, the worst is that it carries a curse. The Weissfrau, the White Lady of Hohenzellern, is said to be the apparition of the Countess Kunigund von Orlemont, a widow and a mother of 2 children. In 1340, her husband Otto VI, Count of Weimar Orlemund, died. Sometime after this, she fell in love with Albert of Nuremberg, also known as Albrecht the Fair of the House of Hohenzollern. He was 15 years younger than her, and he refused to marry her, stating that 4 eyes separated them. He meant the eyes of his parents, but she thought he spoke of her children. Crazed by her love, she removed the children by running a golden hairpin into their skulls. After this murder, Albert looked upon her with horror and would have nothing to do with her. Probably due to her noble blood, despite murdering her children, she was allowed to become abbess of a Cistercian convent at Himmelsthron. Surely there was the inducement when she used her vast inheritance to give an endowment to the convent of the Celestial Throne in 1342. She died there in 1382 when she was 79 years old. Coincidentally, the Cistercian order's habit is all white. The house of Hohenzollern for hundreds of years has been haunted by the White Lady who appears to warn of imminent death. She was described as tall, very thin, and she always carried a bunch of large keys attached to a chatelaine at her waist. The Hohenzollerns had ruled the Principality of Kumbach-Bayreuth since about 1260 AD, and eventually moved their primary palace from Plassenburg to Bayreuth in the 15th century. The White Lady moved with them. In 1486, Albert Achilles, the third son of Frederick the First Hohenzollern, Elector of Brandenburg, reported seeing the White Lady shortly before his death. After 1488, there were numerous reports of her phantom being seen about Castle Plassenburg, a Hohenzollern fortress and residence from which they administered their Franconian territories until about 1604. The earliest recorded appearance of the White Lady was to the Countess of Leiningen before the death of the Elector Joachim I of Brandenburg in 1535. She was seen in 1540 and again in 1594, and was credited with slamming doors, rattling chains, assaulting maids, and strangling the cook. She was then seen by Anna Sidau, the mistress of Joachim II in 1571. She was the widow of a gun founder when the Elector fell in love with her and took her as his mistress. When he was on his deathbed, he made his son promise to treat her kindly, but he had hardly grown cold when his successor, John George, arrested and kept her confined for the rest of her life until 1575 in Spandau Citadel. Some believe the White Lady is Anna Sidau, the pretty foundress, as the people of Berlin called her, who some believe was the unfortunate lady immured alive. When converting the Berlin City Palace in 1709, A female skeleton is said to have been found, which was attributed to the white woman and honestly buried in the hope of ending the hauntings. In other words, there was a belief that she was the white lady and that she was haunting because she was immured alive, means she was walled up alive. By the close of the 16th century, the white lady was seen at the time any member of House of Hohenzellern was about to die. She appeared in 1598, 8 days before the death of the Prince Elector John George. More than likely, she is another white lady, and it's her spirit that haunts the palace at Berlin and at Potsdam out of revenge and the broken oath. She's seen before any great disaster to Prussia, especially in the years 1640, 1740, and 1840. In other words, some people believe that the original white lady and Anna Sidau are two separate white ladies, and that Anna is haunting because she was basically imprisoned until her death in Spandau. But as to the original white lady, she was seen once again in 1619 when Elector Johann Sigismund lay on his deathbed. He asked his chaplain if she had been sighted. Days before his death, she was seen by a page in a corridor near the tower of the Green Hat Palace, where it's believed she exists in some hidden room. The page thought she was a real woman and attempted to snake an arm around her waist, saying, "Lovely mask, where goest?" However, his arm went through her. The spirit raised one of the many keys she is said to carry and tapped him on the forehead with it. The frightened page retold his story, and it was said that as time went by, he grew slim and pale. Where once he had been masculine and hardy, he transformed slowly in life until he walked around quietly, and that when he died, only a sack of bleached bones were found in his bed. Johann Sigismund died less than 2 weeks after the page sighted her in the corridor. In 1628, she was seen by a priest, and she was reported to have said in Latin, "Veni judica vivos e mortuoso," which translates to, "I have come to judge the living and the dead." The year was 1667, and Louise Henriette, the wife of the great elector, was lying ill. The sick lady had seen the white lady sitting at her writing desk. Within a few days, she had died. In 1670, the white lady appeared in Berlin to the Margrave Christian Ernst and to his wife, Erdmuth Sophia, at Bayreuth. In 1677, the Margrave, Erdmann Philip of Brandenburg, said he saw the white lady sitting in his armchair as he entered his chamber in Bayreuth. He started back and left the room in terror. Next day he mounted his horse in the castle court, when the brute reared and plunged, as though seeing something that alarmed it, and threw the prince. He picked himself up and unassisted mounted to his chamber, but in 2 hours was dead. In 1688, she appeared before the death of the great elector. In February 1713, King Frederick I declared that he had been forewarned by her of approaching decease. The White Lady is also credited with heralding the 1810 death of the Duchess Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, which was the Queen Consort of Prussia, the 1861 death of Prussian King Frederick William IV, and a host of lesser Hohenzollern family members. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte defeated Prussia and reduced Bayreuth to a heavily taxed province of the French Empire. In 1812, Bonaparte reportedly spent a night in the former Bayreuth Palace of the Hohenzollerns, and was so disturbed by experiences that night that he left the next day and referred to it as his Maudit Chateau, the Cursed Palace. After the French occupation, the castle was returned to Austrian control after the War of the Austrian Succession. It was rarely occupied and fell to ruins after the last owner left in 1798. In 1819, Crown Prince Frederick William IV of Prussia made plans to rebuild the castle that was started in 1846 and finished in 1867. One of the last reported sightings of the White Lady was in 1914, just before World War I. She appeared just before the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. After Germany's defeat in World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II was the last ruling Hohenzollern who abdicated the throne. It is stated that once there was no longer a Hohenzellern ruler, the White Lady was finally able to find peace. But many state that the White Lady was seen one last time during World War II in 1945, just before Berlin burned. The current owner, George Frederick, is the great-great-grandson and historic heir of Wilhelm II, the last German emperor and king of Prussia, who was the eldest grandchild of Queen Victoria, renounced the throne and went into exile at the end of World War I in 1918. To this day, no one occupies the palace year-round, and tourists are prohibited from taking pictures of the interior. Another story, with an explanation for the identity of the White Lady and her fate, dates back to 1846. Now, the general belief regarding this White Lady is that she was, in the days of her flesh, the Princess Agnes of Meran, consort of Otto VI, Count of Orlemont, who left her a widow somewhere about the year 1340 with 2 sons. Agnes intrigued. When they mean intrigued, means apparently she was having an affair. And they say here whether during the life of her husband or afterward does not appear, but she intrigued with Albert the Fair, Burgrave of Nuremberg, of the house of Hohenzollern, and expected when both were left at liberty by the death of their respective mates that he would marry her. The Orlemont boys, however, seemed to stand in the way of this union. She murdered them, for which crime the Burgrave, who probably was glad of an excuse to get rid of her, put her to death. Since that time, her restless spirit wanders from one place of the Hohenzollern family to another, and every house that contracts a matrimonial alliance with the descendants of Burgrave Albert acquires, along with the other honors flowing from such a connection, that of a share in the visitation of the White Lady. The following is a circumstance which occurred to a lady in her youth, described in her own words. I was a child of 13 or 14 years old. Sister Christina was a year older, but Sister Charlotte was the eldest, and we considered her quite a grown-up lady. Mademoiselle H., a maid of honor to the Queen, was fond of Charlotte and took her to live with herself at the palace, where she was often visited by me and Christina. Once, when our mother went on a journey for a week, she quartered us also on Mademoiselle, and we took up our abode in the palace till her return. This was high jubilee for me in particular, for since that time the King Frederick the Only had tapped me on the cheek and said, "Get away with you, bold thing." I'd taken a prodigious liking to the palace. Christina and I had been about a week at the palace and amused ourselves as young princesses do. That is, we had our dinner out of the royal kitchen and drove out when Mademoiselle chose. One afternoon, it happened that we were left alone, our hostess, with Charlotte, having gone out to pay visits. All of a sudden, we heard the tones of a harp. I sprang to the window, thinking there was somebody playing in the square before the palace. We hearkened with attention, and it seemed to us as if the sounds came from under the great stove, which stood in a corner of the room. I seized the ell-wand, which we had to measure out work, and stuck doughtily with it under the stove. The music ceased, but in the same moment the ell-wand was, with great force, snatched from my hand. I was now really frightened, but Christina laughed at me and asserted that the music was after all nowhere but in the street, and that my weapon, together with my valor, had got stuck in some mouse-hole. I was ashamed, and to hide my embarrassment ran out, under the pretense of having to buy some ribbon in a neighboring mercer's shop. When I returned half an hour after, I found the scene greatly altered. Christina lay in a swoon. Mademoiselle H. and Charlotte were come back from their visit, and together with a maid of the former were occupied in efforts to bring the unconscious one back to life. The maid had been in the third room from ours, heard a sudden shriek, and on running to see what was the matter, found Christina in this state. It was not without great difficulty that Christina was brought to herself, when she related that hardly had I left the room ere the strange musical sounds again made themselves heard, but came this time quite distinctly out of the corner where the great stove was. It grew louder and stronger, and filled the whole room with the tones of a strange but sweet harmony. Christina felt a vague fear creep over her, But when, on a sudden, a white figure shaped itself in that same corner of the room and walked straight towards her, she lost consciousness and knew no more till she came to herself in the arms of Charlotte. Mademoiselle H. was very superstitious and very fond of money. She immediately examined the place about the stove in the hopes of finding some indication that a treasure was hid there. It now struck us as all very remarkable, what we had never observed before, that the flooring in this place was set in a manner quite different from the other work of this room. It seemed to have been done at a more recent period than the rest, as if a portion of the floor had been removed and a new woodwork laid down in the place. Mademoiselle H. was now fully convinced that under this covering a privy chamber of Plutus lay. She enjoined silence on us, promised golden mountains, and sent down the maid to bring up as secretly as possible the wood chopper with his heavy axe. He also was pledged to silence, and an ample amount of coin was promised him, and to work he went. The slight parquet was soon broken up, and behold, another flooring, of firmer construction, presented itself. Mademoiselle H.'s eagerness increased. She put her own hand to the work. The second obstacle was removed, and then opened itself to our wondering eyes a profound vault, out of which a long imprisoned charnel vapor came rushing forth. I flew to throw the windows open, for the stench was suffocating. Mademoiselle H. sent the maid for torches to illuminate the murky depths, and then indeed did a side present itself which we had not reckoned on. A depth that, notwithstanding 2 torches, lots itself in impenetrable shadow, met with its yawning darkness, our baffling gaze. At the far side we could distinguish projecting iron ledges, placed at certain intervals, on which was lying quicklime. Nothing more was to be made out. We let down a weight fastened to a cord, and could calculate that this vaulted oubliette was of the full height of the palace, from the ground to the 3rd floor. Mademoiselle H. would gladly have changed the quicklime into gold, but her alchemy did not reach so far. She now thought it advisable to put the queen in possession of the whole matter, and for this purpose waited on her majesty. The royal lady did not seem in the least surprised at what she heard, and had the following explanation of it. The apparition, she said, was the restless shadow of a Countess of Orlamund, who had been immured alive in this vault. She was the mistress of a Margrave of Brandenburg, to whom she bore 2 sons. On the death of the Margravine, she urged him to make her his wife, but the Margrave resisted her solicitation on the ground that the illegitimate children might one day make pretensions to the throne and endanger the rights of the princes born in wedlock. Hereupon the unnatural mother resolved to put out of the way what hindered her ambitious views, and so poisoned her own 2 children. The crime was discovered, and the Margrave, whose love changed into inexorable rigor, had her immured alive in a privately constructed vault of the palace, without withdrawing the veil of secrecy from the dark transaction. The soul of the Countess had no rest in this roomy grave, and every 7 years assumed its corporeal garb, and in this appeared, generally giving previous notice of its appearance by tones like those of a harp, which instrument the Countess is said to have been a mistress. It had been remarked, the Queen said, that the spectre oftenest showed itself to children, from which it was believed that the love which she had pressed back into her heart, denying it to her own children in life, now drove her up out of the silent kingdom of death in order to seek reconciliation with childhood at large, against which, in the person of her boys, she had so heavily sinned. And this was the true story of the so-called White Lady. The same evening, the apartment of Mademoiselle H. was inspected by a royal architect and declared unfit to be inhabited. Another suite of rooms were accordingly assigned her on the 2nd floor, to which we removed the next day. Christina took it in her head that the apparition was an omen of death, and that she would soon have to leave this world. It turned out so. She died in the very blossom and beauty of her girlhood. The foregoing narrative clears up a point of which we express some uncertainty, namely, whether Burgrave Albert's intrigue with the Countess Agnes commenced before the death of her husband. It appears that it did, and even that the reputed sons of the Count of Orlamund were in reality the fruit of it. That the lover of Agnes is here spoken of as a Margrave of Brandenburg is no contradiction of the popular belief, which makes him a Burgrave of Nuremberg, for the princes of Hohenzellern, the ancestors of the former royal family of Prussia, united these two titles. The inspiration for the White Lady may stretch back to pre-Christian Norse mythology in the form of the goddess Freya or Frigg, known as Berta in Germanic history. Like the unfortunate princess, she was the mother of two sons. She is the wife of Odin. She wears a white robe and is the bringer of life and death. It is believed that from her sprung all Germanic noble and royal houses. So, that is the two stories of the White Ladies. And in this last one, as you can see, there's always that theme. Because, by the way, all these people that are mentioned historically did exist. They did exist. And there's always that theme of the White Lady in life killing her children. There was her children, or that she had children by her lover, even though she was married. Bottom line, that her children stood in the way and she murdered them. And in one version, she goes off to be an abbess because of her royal blood. They, let her go and be an abbess. And she had so much money because remember, her husband, her real husband, died, left her a vast inheritance. She becomes the abbess of a Cistercian convent. The other version's not so lucky. Basically, she's buried alive. She's thrown down an oubliette by her lover. Her husband's died. She's killed her children. All right, whether it's her children by him, because you have to understand, she's expecting that he's going to marry her, and his wife had died, but he has legitimate children, and he's thinking, if I marry you, those two children, technically, though illegitimate, but legitimate because they're not mine, they could come and try to claim a legitimate against my real heirs. You have to think that back in those days, I think this was really important. Bottom line, she doesn't care about her kids, does away with them, and there she is. So, I hope you like this short little excerpt into the Curse of the White Ladies, and I will be seeing you guys soon. Till then, you are all wonderful, and take care.